Hello, this is Amos the STEM guy, also known as Amos the Math guy. Amos the STEM guy plus Amos the Math guy equals STEM excellence by God's grace. In this video series, we're going to be going through a book called Journey Through Genius, written by Dr. William Dunham. Now, I've written my own resource called Tools for Master Mathematics, which you can find in the on our website, as well as a math curriculum called Inspirational Mathematics 1, 2, and 3. Together, they're take you from basic counting all the way to calculus. So that's a little bit about my background. I'm a medical physicist as well as a math and science curriculum writer with a degree in chemistry from the University of Wisconsin in Superior. So let's look at the book that we're going to be studying. It's right here. It's called Journey Through Genius. So join us as we study the lives of Isaac Newton, Blaise Pascal, Leonard Euler. There are other chapters in this book, but we're going to focus our efforts now in the scientific revolution, which gave us physics and so on and so forth. So stay tuned for more books in this series. The great mathematicians of the 1600s, the 15 and 1600s, are people such as Napier, Descartes, Pascal, Fermat. We know these names. These French mathematicians were doing some great work, but they were heroes indeed, the author here says, of Journey Through Genius. Of course, no one on the summer day of 1661 would have thought to pay attention to the quiet beginning of a mathematical journey that would soon eclipse all these great mathematicians I just mentioned, including Pascal, who's one of my favorites. One of our institutes now is called the Blaise Pascal Institute. I love Blaise Pascal. But the journey was about to, like the history of math was about to change. The journey was to commence at a beautiful Trinity College of Cambridge University. In the summer of 1661, a young lad from nearby Woolsthorpe was about to begin his university career. He had previously shown promise, but much the same might have been said about the dozen or so equally obscure classmates with whom he began his Trinity experience. But this lad was on his way to become the supreme hero of the heroic century and simultaneously to change the way mankind would ever look at the world. His name was Isaac Newton. Newton was born on Christmas Day of 1642, the same day that Galileo died, the same year that Galileo died. He was a dangerously premature infant, frail and tiny enough to be put into a cork pot. Adding to his woes, his father had died in early October. So Newton's mother was left alone to care for this delicate newborn. Somehow, the baby overcame these initial dangers and the harsh Lincolnshire winter, and in the end, Isaac would live to the impressive age of 84. I read a little bit of this story when I was in college about 13, 14 years ago. Well, actually, it was about 15 years ago while I was still in college. And it's amazing what that story can do. Newton was born premature in a difficult situation where his father had died. And it did not hinder him from becoming who he became. Never allow your beginning to affect your end. Never allow your beginning to affect your progress. Never allow your mistakes or stories of the past to affect you in the present, right? Thomas Sowell talks about this, Booker T. Washington, Frederick Douglass. There's a lot of articles, stories, books on all of that. So my name is Amos the STEM guy, Amos the Math guy, and I'm all about STEM excellence and helping young people to flourish in their understanding of math and science. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about Sir Isaac Newton, the greatest mathematician scientist the world has ever seen. In my book, STEM Excellence, coming out in 2024, I am exploring this topic of how do we raise the next generation of scientists, mathematicians, and thinkers, right? And that's part of what I'm about, is raising that next generation to walk in humility as they learn philosophy and logic also along the way. So let's read a little more about Isaac Newton. So Isaac Newton, although the physical hardships were overcome, those of a personal nature proved far more lasting. When Newton was 3, his mother, Hannah Isco Newton, married Barnabas Smith, the 63-year-old rector of a nearby village. Smith, although eager to have a young wife, was not in the market for a 3-year-old as well. Thus, when Newton's mother moved in with her new husband, young Isaac was left behind to be cared for by his grandmother. The pain of separation from his only surviving parent must have been overwhelming. Her proximity would have been sheer torture, for he could easily have climbed a tree and gazed out across the heath to see the village church spire where his mother and stepfather lived. Isaac, a child who had never known his father, had now lost his mother as well. not to the scourge of disease, but to the cruelty of indifference. As we shall see, Newton would grow into a neurotic and misanthropic adult, one who rarely experienced the warm glow of human friendship. It is an easy matter to attribute such character traits to his abandonment by the one person about whom his world had revolved. As Isaac grew, he received a respectable grammar school education in the style of the day, which is to say an education heavy on the study of Latin and Greek. Outside the school, he kept largely to himself, occupying his time by reading or building various miniature devices of great charm and delicacy. It is said that he built a small working windmill driven by a mouse upon a treadmill. He made sundials and positioned them at various key points about his quarters. Or he took to attaching a lighted lantern to a high-flying kite on dark spring evenings, a phenomenon that must have terrorized residents of the quiet English countryside. Such activities indicate a very agile young mind, not totally absorbed by the conjugation of Latin verbs. They also presaged the gifted experimental physicist whose practical laboratory devices would prove invaluable in the development of his theories. Please know that he learned another language, like Latin and Greek. We need students to make sure they know at least one other language. That's my big encouragement to families. Help your child, give them the tools to learn another language. Latin is good, Greek is good, Hebrew is intense, but Hebrew is good. I speak Hausa and English, but it is helpful to have another language vocabulary. So I want to encourage you to encourage your children, whether it's French or German or Italian or Spanish, learn another language. It does something. So Newton learned Latin and Greek. We can learn in raising the next generation of scientists and mathematicians that it helps to learn some other language and to have some tools. So the British, right, have a huge number when it comes to mathematicians, top mathematicians. And we can see how they educate their people, right, in math and science. Well, actually, in life, in Greek and Latin. And it helps in math and science in some ways. Let's carry on with Newton's story. And so it was that Isaac Newton set off for Trinity College, Cambridge, in the summer of 1661. At that time, the quiet town on the River Cam, I was just out there last year, so on the River Cam, had already been a site of higher learning for 400 years. So it was an old and established institution in which Newton found himself. So it's kind of like you going to Harvard now, right? Imagine Cambridge back then. That's the advantage they have. So it was an old and established institution. Cambridge had specifically flourished earlier in the century with the rise of Puritanism and Reformation zeal in England. It could boast everything from the King James translation of the Bible to the architectural masterpiece that was King's College Chapel, to the most Puritan of leaders, Oliver Cromwell, who hailed from nearby Huntingdon and had attended Sydney Sussex College of Cambridge until 1617. When Newton arrived, much of this past glory was in jeopardy, and the reasons were intimately linked to the vicissitudes of recent British history. In 1642, the year of Newton's birth, the Puritans under Cromwell had brought to a successful conclusion their long campaign against the monarchy. Cromwell himself assumed control of the English government, an authority that had become unquestioned when in 1649 King Charles I was beheaded in Whitehall, London. The Royalists, whose base of support was anchored at Oxford University, were in temporary eclipse, while the Puritans of Cambridge had their days of glory. These days were not to last, however. The Puritan Commonwealth proved to be little better, and perhaps even worse than the monarchy it had replaced. When Cromwell died in 1658, no Puritan leader could fill the void. The British sentiment soon called for a return to kingly rule. Thus, in 1660, Charles II, son of the beheaded king, was placed upon the throne in what came to be known as the Restoration. Needless to say, this turned the tables. Cambridge University became a natural target for the suspicions and hostility of the newly empowered royalists. When Newton arrived the year after the Restoration, the place was characterized by political intrigue, patronage, and lethargy. It was far from an ideal situation. We who today revere Cambridge as one of the handful of truly great centers of learning may find hard to believe the state in which to which conditions had decayed in the 1660s. Professors were appointed for political or ecclesiastical reasons, and for many, scholarship was simply irrelevant. There are records of faculty members who occupied their positions for half a century without having a single student or writing a single book. or given a single lecture. Some, in fact, did not even live in the Cambridge area and visited only infrequently. So the situation was not ideal, but Newton came into this situation. Clearly, it didn't stop him from doing what he did. It didn't stop him from becoming the greatest, right? The greatest of the greats when it comes to mathematical sciences. With such indifference among the professorate, it is no surprise that the students were often equally immune to the pursuit of higher learning. On paper, the university maintained the pretense of a vibrant intellectual life, heavily slanted toward the classical curriculum for its scholarly young men. In reality, Cambridge students indulged rather heavily in such activities as drinking at the ubiquitous pubs. It was certainly possible for student and professor alike to coast through Cambridge with very little intellectual exertion. That's a very sad reality of college life. Sometimes college students go and they're just partying and they're wasting their lives, right? Newton wasn't one of those people. This is very interesting to see what's going on in Cambridge at the time. And it's really sad that you can start out as a great institution and you can have some lethargy that sweeps in. So that's why it's important to always ask and to be awake and alert and ask, how are we doing right now? Are we slacking off? Cambridge at this time was slacking off. And you can see how some of the historical context in England affected some of the situation at Cambridge. This is why I believe we need to teach the history and philosophy of math and science in our science and math classrooms so people have a context for what they're learning. At first, Isaac Newton took the stated expectations at face value. He began to prescribe courses in Latin literature and Aristotelian philosophy, but gradually abandoned the project, either because he realized that he knew more than his tutors, or because he recognized the irrelevance of the moribund curriculum, or simply because it was clear that no one really cared whether or not he did the work. Teachers need to care, please. His colleagues at Trinity probably had the same reaction, but whereas they were likely to run off to a pub for their nightly carousing and doing the wrong things, now they're doing the wrong things they shouldn't be doing, Newton turned his attention elsewhere. Guys, if you go to college, you need to be focused on studying, not partying. That's not why you should go to college. You should go to college because it helps you with your vision for life. So if you need direction and career prep, reach out. We have a career prep course. We want to help you to make good decisions about your future. So you don't rush to college just because you want to have a good time with your friends. What is a good time? I mean, honestly, a good time is doing math problems with friends and talking philosophy and theology. That's a good time. Unfortunately, some college students would disagree with me, but that's really what we should be focused about, is learning more about the world. And so this is one of the reasons why students need to be careful. When they go to college, they need to have a vision. Why are you going to college? What is your goal and aspiration there? You need to have a vision for life first and then see if college fits into that vision. If it doesn't fit into that vision, maybe you're supposed to go be an apprentice or do something else, then please do that. But some people literally choose to go to certain colleges because they want to go party and do things they shouldn't be doing. Now, Newton wasn't like that. Newton, instead of going to places he shouldn't go, he actually read voraciously. He turned his attention elsewhere when he wasn't getting the intellectual fulfillment he wanted from Cambridge. And he could be seen walking across the grounds in deep contemplation. When an idea captured his interest, Newton could be impossibly single-minded and would often neglect to eat or sleep in favor of long bouts with an especially intriguing problem. He also displayed, especially early in his Cambridge days, a streak of old-fashioned guilt, evident in the fact that he kept a list of his sins in a notebook. These included everything from a failure to pray it often enough, to being inattentive at church services, to having unclean thoughts, words, actions, and dreams. Certainly the Puritan strain ran deep, but one might expect as much from a solitary, introspective young man who grew up where and when he did. When not sinning or writing about it, this ever-curious student would conduct experiments on the nature of light, color, and vision. For instance, he once stared at the sun for an excessively long period, then dutifully recorded the spots and flashes that affected his vision for days afterward. In fact, he had to confine himself to the darkness for some time to let the images gradually fade. On another occasion, curious about the effect of the eyeball's shape in distorting and altering vision, he devised a particularly gruesome experiment with himself as the subject. I do not recommend any of these things, please. But, that's too much of trying to prove a point in science. But I wanted to talk briefly about these two books. One is called Logic by Isaac Watts, and the other one is called Biblical Theology by John Owen. Here's what's interesting. Isaac Watts was born in 1674. As you learn about some of the hymns that Watts wrote and things like that. But when you talk about Puritans and people that took knowledge seriously and logic and so on. Isaac Watts is one of them. His book here is called Logic, The Right Use of Reason in the Inquiry After Truth, right? And then this other guy, John Owen, was born in 1616, so long before Newton. He went to Queen's College in Oxford. So why do I bring these guys up? Because I am pretty sure that Newton would have read books about some of these people, especially John Owen, some of that type of writing, right? So that's where we see some of his faith piece coming into work here. So there's nothing wrong with learning science well and also having faith and understanding the God who created the world. So biblical theology and logic will show you a little glimpse into life at Cambridge and Oxford in the 1600s. So let's read a little more about Newton. This is a quote from Newton. It says that Newton described this situation. He took a small stick or bodkin and pushed it betwixt my eye and ye bone as near to ye backside of my eye as I could, and pressing my eye with the end of it. He talks about what he did with this terrible stuff that he did. This disgusting procedure was illustrated by a drawing in Newton's hand showing, just doing things he shouldn't be doing. Let's just say Newton was doing experiments that he should have stayed. Calm down, Newton. For all the deficiencies of the Restoration Cambridge, it did possess a wonderful library, the very resource necessary for an inquiring mind of the first order. So how do we raise the next generation of scientists, mathematicians, and theologians? We get them to read a lot. They need to read the history and philosophy of science. They need to read the history of science. They need to read their books, and they need to read other resources. There's no going around it. There's something about reading. Now, Cambridge University has one of the massive libraries, right? When we went to Cambridge, we saw a section where they pointed to all the libraries. Well, they have many libraries in all these colleges. And then, of course, they have the Cambridge University Press, which makes books for like the IGSCE. If you're studying for the Cambridge exams, by the way, and you need any help, let me know. I can schedule some small group tutoring sessions for those as well, for math especially. Math and chemistry, physics. So, for all the deficiencies, they had a library, big library. There is a story that while at the Sturbridge Fair in 1663, Newton picked up a book on astrology. Oh, that's where there's a problem there. To help him understand its geometric diagrams, he decided he needed to acquaint himself with Euclid's elements. Interestingly, on his first reading, he found this ancient text to be full of trivial. It says that on his first reading, he found this ancient text to be full of trivial and self-evident results. An opinion, by the way, which a mature Newton would abandon. One striking thing about Newton's reading at this time was that he was not content to stick with the Greek classics. He devoured Descartes' geometry, but only with great effort. Remember how we talked about how René Descartes, in our video about the French mathematicians, Descartes' work influenced some of the work of Newton. So he devoured Descartes' geometry, but only with great effort. He later recalled beginning the work and reading a few pages until utterly stumped. So Newton wasn't perfect. Even Newton was stumped by someone's math writings. Then he would return to page 1 and begin anew, this time penetrating a bit further before the writings became incomprehensible. Again, he would start over, and by this gradual process, he plowed his way through La Géométrie without the assistance of a single tutor or professor. Of course, given the sorry state of affairs among the staff and the classical flavor of the stated curriculum, he may have had difficulty finding anyone qualified to help. So this is why in our curriculum, Counting to Calculus, which takes people through all of math, from basic elementary math all the way to calculus, we're trying to teach them the importance of mastery, right? In my book, Tools for Mastering Mathematics, that's what I try to talk about is we need to help students to master the concepts. What is the concept you're trying to learn? Let's help you to master the concept. This idea is articulated in Peak by Dr. Anders Ericsson. In his book, he talks about deliberate practice, which is one of the best ways to learn. Find what you need to learn and then apply yourself to master that particular concept. So in math, for example, when I ask people in Algebra 1, what are you working on? I don't expect them to say, oh, I'm just in Algebra 1. Or I'm just in Chapter 7 of Algebra 1. What I want them to say is, I'm factoring polynomials where the leading coefficient is 1. Now we know exactly what skill they're working on, and then we can go from there. Okay, so let's look at a little more of Newton's biography, and then we'll wrap up this episode. So he didn't settle for the classics alone. He devoured Descartes' geometry, but only with great effort, as we said. So there was one Cambridge professor, however, who indeed had such qualifications. His name was Isaac Barrow. He lived from 1630 to 1677. He was the occupant of the prestigious Lucasian Chair of Mathematics. That role is what Stephen Hawking had at Cambridge University. So the Lucasian Chair of Mathematics. While Barrow was certainly not Newton's teacher in anything like a modern sense, he undoubtedly had some contact with the budding scholar and may have directed Newton to the major sources of contemporary mathematics. Now, please note that Dr. Stephen Hawking and I do not agree on theological things, but I just wanted to say that people who are very, very smart in the world of physics and math are the ones who would have held that position, and Newton had come to know this gentleman. So it says that by reading and thinking constantly, Newton advanced from a fairly ordinary scientific and mathematical background to a mastery of the most up-to-date discoveries of the time. Having brought himself to the frontier, he was now ready to move into uncharted territory. In 1664, Newton was promoted to the status of scholar at Trinity, thus acquiring a 4-year period of financial support toward a master's degree. This promotion brought with it even greater freedom to follow his interests. And this freedom, combined with the solid background of his readings, was about to unleash one of the most extraordinary intellects in history. More than ever, Newton applied his intense, almost unbelievable powers of concentration to attack the problems before him. In the 20th century, the famous Cambridge economist John Maynard Keynes made this assessment of Newton's abilities. His peculiar gift was the power of holding continuously in his mind a purely mental problem until he had seen straight through it. Anyone who has ever attempted pure scientific or philosophical thought knows how one can hold a problem momentarily in one's mind and apply all one's power of concentration to piercing through it, and how it would dissolve and escape, and you find that you are surveying, what you're surveying is a blank. I believe that Newton could hold a problem in his mind for hours and days and weeks until it surrendered to him its secrets. Newton's own explanation of how he solved his wonderful problems was similar, if a bit more prosaic, by thinking on them continuously. In a feverish excitement of discovery, the next few years would see him ever more often working late into the night by the glimmer of candlelight. And it is said that his uncomplaining cat grew fat eating Newton's untouched dinners. But missed meals and lost sleep were inconsequential compared to the strides this young man was making. He had embarked upon what were probably the most productive 2 years that any thinker, certainly any 23-year-old thinker, has ever experienced. His days of triumph were spent in part at Cambridge and in part back at Woolsthorpe because of the closing of the university necessitated by an outbreak of the dreaded plague. Early in 1665, he discovered what we now call the generalized binomial theorem, which became a major component of his subsequent mathematical works. Soon thereafter, he came upon his method of fluxions, today better known by the name of differential calculus. And in 1666, he devised the inverse method of fluxions that is called integral calculus. In between, he formulated his groundbreaking theory of colors. But Newton recalled that there was more. The same year, I began to think of gravity extending to the orb of the moon, and I deduced that the forces which keep the planets in their orbits or orbs must be reciprocally as the squares of their distances from the centers about which they revolve, and thereby compared the force requisite to keep the moon in her orb with the force of gravity at the surface of the earth, and found them to answer pretty nearly. These recollections, made half a century later by the aged Newton, describe perfectly the embryonic theory of universal gravitation, upon which more than any other single achievement rests his scientific fame. Surveying these discoveries, he observed with a remarkable candor and nonchalance. All this was in 2 plague years, 1665 to 1666, for in those days I was in the prime of my age for invention and minded mathematics and philosophy more than at any time since. So those were like key years for Newton. That's why we need our young people to be reading good books to make the most of their key years, right? These 2 plague years have since come to be called Newton's Anni Mirabilis, or wonderful years, and indeed they were. A popular legend says that during this time, all of his theories emerged complete and full-blown from his fertile mind. This is surely an exaggeration, for in the years ahead, Newton would continually refine and improve upon these theories. Yet, the burst of creativity he exhibited in this short span of time did define and direct not only the research of his own lifetime, but in a very substantial way, the future of science itself. Today, it is easy to forget that Newton made these extraordinary discoveries as a totally anonymous Cambridge student. Professor R.S. Westphal, perhaps the most foremost Newton biographer of our day, addressed this remarkable fact in the following memorable passage. Newton's triumph was a virtuoso performance that would have left the mathematicians of Europe breathless in admiration, envy, and awe. As it happened, only one other mathematician in Europe, Isaac Barrow, even knew that Newton existed. And it is unlikely that in 1666 Barrow had any inkling of his accomplishment. The fact that he was unknown does not alter the other fact that the young man, not yet 24, without benefit of formal instruction, had become the leading mathematician of Europe and the only one who had really mattered. Newton himself understood, the only one who had really mattered, Newton himself understood his position clearly enough. He had studied the acknowledged masters. He knew the limits they could not surpass, and he outstripped them all and by far. This is the importance of teaching the history of science right there. Newton had studied those who came before him. As we have seen, the focus of mathematical scholarship has shifted from place to place throughout history, from the Pythagoreans at Crotona to Plato's Athenian Academy to Alexandria to Baghdad, and then to the Renaissance Italy of Cardano and Ferrari, and incredibly in the mid-1660s it came to rest in the modest rooms of a Trinity College student, and wherever Newton was, there too was the mathematical center of the world. The book goes on to give us Newton's binomial theorem. It gives us some of the explanations and the work. Pascal's triangle is actually another name we call this. Some of this work is tied to Pascal's triangle. The Chinese mathematician Yang Hui also had some things to do with this in the 13th century. So I keep moving. I'm moving along here in the book. It's showing us more of Newton's calculations. Newton had a general approximation of pi that is shown here as well. And then there's an epilogue, which we can dissect later, but there's an epilogue in the book which tells us about Newton. So here's where we're going to land the plane, and then we'll talk more about the later years of Isaac Newton. Here's a quote that we're going to come back to. It says, in Westminster Abbey, there's an epitaph that says, mortals, or actually Newton himself said, I do not know what I may appear to the world, but to myself I seem to have been only like a boy playing on the seashore and diverting myself in now and then, finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than ordinary, whilst the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me. That's a little modest, Newton. The ocean of truth that lays ahead of you. I mean, we're still trying to decipher things, Newton, that you did back in the day, right? Newton is dead, of course, now. But it's amazing that he thought he had a lot more he could accomplish. But, of course, life, everybody only has a period of time they live here. But perhaps we should leave him finally at rest in Westminster Abbey. We'll come back to more of his life, but let's just read this section. It says, mortals, congratulate yourselves that so great a man has lived for the honor of the human race. Mortals, congratulate yourself that so great a man has lived for the honor of the human race. Sir Isaac Newton was a blessing to the world. And we will read more about his later life, but this is Journey Through Genius. We've talked about French mathematicians. Now we've talked about Isaac Newton. We're going to finish next time with the second part on Isaac Newton, and then we'll do some math problems. I made a video a few weeks ago on Amos, this math guy. If you go down to the very early videos, I made a video about the difference of squares and the difference of cubes and the patterns that are observed. And Newton's differential calculus actually gives us a better explanation for how to find what those patterns are. I thought I'd discovered something new, but nope, Newton had done it already. So anyway, stay tuned for more videos, and reach out if you have any questions about the history of math, history of science. Feel free to join my subscription program if you want to support our work. You'll see it in the course, Amos the STEM Guy on Teachable. The link is in the description. Take care. Please subscribe, share, and we'll see you soon. I'll be in Cambridge this summer. If you want to learn more on the history of math and science, then please check out my course on that as well, which will be coming out this summer. Take care and have a blessed day.